In 1940, while Europe was drowning in war, one man was quietly laying the foundation for something far worse. He wasn't a soldier on the front lines. He didn't lead armies or drop bombs. But he created a place where over 1 million people would vanish, systematically, silently. Rudolf Höss didn't just follow orders. He engineered death like it was a routine. And in the end, he was hanged at the very place he helped turn into hell. Rudolf Höss was born on November 25, 1901, in the spa town of Baden-Baden in southwestern Germany. He was the eldest of 3 children in a deeply conservative Roman Catholic family. His father was a former army officer who believed in rigid discipline, religious duty, and unquestioning loyalty. Conversations in the household were dominated by ideas of sacrifice, obedience, and honor. From a very early age, Höss was taught to suppress emotion and follow authority without hesitation. His father expected him to join the priesthood, and his education was tailored toward that path, filled with catechism, Latin, and moral instruction. But the outbreak of World War I in 1914 shifted everything. At just 14, Höss volunteered at a military hospital to serve the German cause. 2 years later, at 16, he falsified his age to enlist in the German army and was accepted into the 21st Regiment of Cavalry. He served in the Ottoman Empire and was later on the Western Front, fighting in some of the harshest conditions of the war. By 1917, he had risen to the rank of Feldwebel, or sergeant, and became one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army. He was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, for his performance. But what the war truly gave him was emotional detachment. The brutality he saw and carried out left him numb. After Germany's defeat in 1918 and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Höss returned home to a broken nation and a shattered identity. Instead of pursuing religious life, he joined the Freikorps, a paramilitary group filled with nationalist veterans who despised the new Weimar Republic. He took part in violent actions against communists and civilians, including the 1923 assassination of a schoolteacher, Walter Kadau, whom Höss believed had betrayed a fellow Nazi. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder, but was released after serving less than 5 years. By the time he joined the Nazi Party in 1922, he had fully embraced the ideology of racial purity, nationalism, and militant obedience. He didn't just want order, he needed it. And in the structure of Nazism, he finally found it. He had found his home. But that early craving for rules and purpose was only the beginning. What came next would sharpen him into something far more dangerous. In 1934, he officially joined the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS, Hitler's paramilitary force tasked with enforcing Nazi ideology and loyalty. He was quickly absorbed into the Totenkampfverbände, the SS unit responsible for guarding and operating concentration camps. A year later, he was assigned to Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp located near Munich. At Dachau, Höss was introduced to a brutal system where control was maintained not through law, but through terror. Prisoners were broken down with beatings, starvation, forced labor, and psychological torture. Höss watched, followed, and learned. In 1938, his efficiency and discipline earned him a promotion to a leadership role at Sachsenhausen, another major camp north of Berlin. There, he began to manage larger groups of prisoners, coordinate roll calls, and implement policies of punishment and isolation. What set him apart was his obsession with order. He didn't simply follow SS procedures, he analyzed them, searching for ways to make every operation smoother, every punishment harsher, and every prisoner more compliant. He studied how to move bodies faster, how to crush resistance before it started, and how to eliminate what the regime saw as waste. Then in May 1940, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, selected Höss for a special assignment. Poland had been occupied, and the Nazis needed a new facility to detain and manage increasing numbers of political prisoners. Höss was ordered to transform an old Polish army barracks near the town of Auschwitz into a functioning concentration camp, Auschwitz. He arrived with clear instructions, but enormous freedom. And in that freedom, Höss saw an opportunity not just to run a camp, but to build a system unlike anything that had existed before. At that moment, he became the commandant of what would soon evolve into the most infamous death camp in human history. Auschwitz wasn't originally planned as a death camp. Its first purpose in 1940 was to hold Polish political prisoners, including resistance members, intellectuals, and anyone seen as a threat to Nazi control in occupied Poland. It started small, but Rudolf Höss saw its potential. He quickly reorganized the layout, introduced stricter discipline, and created systems for forced labor. By 1941, under orders from Himmler, Höss began constructing a second, much larger part of the camp, Auschwitz II, Birkenau. This was no longer about detaining people. It was about eliminating them. Unlike the original camp, Birkenau was designed from the ground up for large-scale extermination. It had wide rail tracks for trains to unload victims directly at the killing site, barracks that could cram in thousands at a time, and zones built for selections and disposal. Höss oversaw the installation of electrified barbed wire fences, wooden barracks with no insulation, and, most importantly, gas chambers and crematoriums. He worked closely with engineers and SS architects to build facilities that could kill and dispose of people faster and more efficiently than anything the Nazis had tried before. This was a calculated system, not chaos. To carry out the killings, Höss supported the use of Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide that had already been tested on Soviet prisoners at another camp. It was cheap, easy to store, and lethal in enclosed spaces. After reviewing the results, Höss approved its use for Auschwitz. In September 1941, the first large-scale test gassing took place in the basement of Block 11. 600 Soviet POWs and 250 sick prisoners were locked inside. Within minutes, they were dead. Höss saw it as a success, not a tragedy. From that moment, Auschwitz was no longer just a camp. It became the engine of the Holocaust. Nearly 90% of the victims were Jews deported from across Europe, Hungary, France, Greece, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. The rest included Polish resistance members, Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, and countless others labeled undesirable by the regime. The camp's operation was relentless. Trains packed with victims arrived daily. People were forced into sealed cattle cars with no space, no food, and no access to toilets. Many died before the doors even opened. Those who survived the journey were immediately separated on the arrival ramp. SS doctors stood at the platform and judged them with a glance. Fit for labor or unfit. The unfit, mostly women, children, the elderly, and the sick, were marched straight to the gas chambers. Höss kept the killing system running like a factory. He calculated how many could be processed in a day and pushed his staff to meet those numbers. He reviewed timetables, gas usage, crematoria output, and disposal rates. His reports were filled with statistics, not names. 4 massive crematoria, each with multiple ovens, operated day and night. Designed by SS engineers, they burned bodies continuously, using the fat from some corpses to keep the fires going. When the number of dead overwhelmed the ovens, prisoners were forced to dig burning pits behind the chambers. Bodies were dumped in and set on fire using fuel and fat from earlier victims. The entire camp stank of death. A thick black smoke constantly rose above the buildings. Ash fell like snow on nearby fields. The soil around the crematoria turned gray and greasy. Local rivers and streams, used to dispose of human remains and waste, became polluted with blood and bone residue. Höss didn't flinch. The killings weren't emotional decisions. They were calculations. But what made him especially terrifying wasn't just how many died under his orders. It was how normal he made it feel. His personal life tells that part of the story. Höss didn't view himself as a murderer. He considered himself an administrator, someone responsible for maintaining order, following orders, and meeting quotas. Just beyond the fences of Auschwitz, Höss lived in a spacious villa with his wife Hedwig and their children. The home stood close enough to the crematoria that the rising smoke was visible from the garden. The smell of burning flesh drifted through their windows daily. It became part of the scenery. Inside the house, life was normal, comfortable, and even. Hedwig maintained a household that was well stocked with goods taken from murdered prisoners, fine furniture, clothing, dishes, and children's toys. Her domestic staff consisted of female inmates, forced to cook, clean, and serve under constant threat. She never complained. In fact, she once referred to Auschwitz as paradise for her family. Their children played in the yard, while bodies were burned just a short distance away. They rode bicycles, received presents, and grew up surrounded by luxury, stolen from those who were being exterminated in the gas chambers nearby. There was no separation between private comfort and public horror. Both existed side by side. Within the camp, Höss ran operations like a business. He expected his SS subordinates to follow orders with precision. He did not tolerate personal theft or drunken behavior, not because it harmed prisoners, but because it disrupted efficiency. Guards were punished for stealing from the Reich or failing to meet work expectations, not for abusing or killing inmates. He believed in structure, not justice. In his mind, the violence had a place, as long as it didn't interfere with the system. Höss never showed remorse, not during the war, and not after. And in that twisted system, the weakest and most vulnerable suffered the most, especially the women and children who were seen not as humans, but as waste to be processed. Their suffering was constant, and their deaths were almost always immediate. Pregnant women were rarely spared. Most were sent straight to the gas chambers without hesitation. For those who managed to hide their pregnancies or gave birth inside the camp, the outcome was even more horrific. Infants were not allowed to live. Babies were drowned in buckets, smashed against walls, or taken by guards and thrown away like garbage. The mothers, if they survived the birth, were usually forced to return to hard labor within hours or executed soon after. Young girls faced another kind of nightmare. SS doctors, especially Josef Mengele, saw them as raw material for experimentation. Girls were injected with unknown substances. Their reproductive organs were removed or damaged intentionally, and their bodies were cut open without pain relief. The goal wasn't treatment. It was data collection. Their suffering was documented, but never acknowledged. Children who came holding their parents' hands were torn away during selection. Mothers screamed. Their children cried. None of it mattered. Small children, especially those under 14, were almost always sent to the gas chambers immediately. They couldn't work, and therefore in Nazi eyes had no value. By 1943, Höss had turned Auschwitz into a full-scale machine of extermination. The camp's killing infrastructure was upgraded. More gas chambers were built. Additional crematoria were installed to handle the increasing number of victims. Some of these new gas chambers could hold up to 2,000 people at a time, designed specifically to kill faster and dispose of bodies without delay. But nothing could prepare Auschwitz for what came in 1944. The genocide of Hungarian Jews would push the camp and Höss's system past any previous limit. In March 1944, Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. Within weeks, plans were in motion to deport the country's Jewish population, the last large group of Jews in Europe still alive. The operation began in May and moved at terrifying speed. In just 8 weeks, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were rounded up, packed into trains, and sent directly to Auschwitz. Most were taken to Birkenau. Many had no idea where they were going. They brought luggage, wore their best clothes, and carried documents believing they were being resettled. But for nearly all of them, the journey ended in death. The majority, men, women, and children, were selected for immediate execution within hours of arrival. The process was so fast and so brutal that it overwhelmed even the killing infrastructure Höss had previously built. Although Höss had been reassigned to a position in Berlin months earlier, he was brought back specifically for this operation because of his experience in mass murder logistics. His return marked a dramatic increase in the pace of extermination. Under his direction, up to 10,000 people were gassed each day during the height of the operation. The crematoria couldn't keep up. Flames burned around the clock, but it wasn't enough. The camp returned to using open-air fire pits, massive trenches dug near the gas chambers. Bodies were stacked, doused in fuel, and burned in enormous piles. The smoke was so thick it blackened the sky, and the stench of burning flesh hung in the air for miles. But by 1944, the war was turning. As the Red Army closed in, the Nazis began to panic, and even Höss couldn't stop the system from collapsing. It became clear that the horrors committed at Auschwitz could soon be exposed to the world. The Nazis began a frantic effort to erase what they had done. Files were gathered and burned. Transport lists, execution orders, architectural plans, anything that could connect names to mass murder was destroyed. Höss, now reassigned but still in communication with senior SS officials, oversaw some of the cover-up operations remotely. In November 1944, Himmler ordered the dismantling of several crematoria at Birkenau. Crematorium 4 was demolished entirely. The gas chambers in the remaining buildings were blown up with explosives. The SS also forced prisoners to exhume mass graves, thousands of decomposed bodies, and burned them in open pits to eliminate physical proof. It was called Aktion 1005, the Nazi operation to hide evidence of genocide. But the scale of the crime was too vast to cover up. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops arrived at the gates of Auschwitz. The guards had fled days earlier, forcing most surviving prisoners on death marches into Germany. Only about 7,000 remained, starving, sick, and abandoned. They were barely alive, many too weak to speak or stand. The soldiers who entered the camp were stunned. What they found wasn't just a prison. It was a death machine that had killed more than 1 million people under the system that Höss helped design. The war was not over yet, but Auschwitz was finally in the hands of the living. But while Auschwitz was liberated, Höss himself wasn't caught. He had vanished. He abandoned his name, uniform, and past. Using false identity papers, he took the name Franz Lang, claiming to be a former naval officer. He settled quietly in a rural village near Flensburg in northern Germany and found work as a gardener at a local estate. He blended in with thousands of other displaced men, hiding in plain sight among the wreckage of post-war chaos. For nearly a year, he avoided detection. The Allies were rounding up high-ranking Nazis, but Höss managed to stay one step ahead. He cut off all ties and kept a low profile, rarely speaking and avoiding travel. But his past was closing in. In early 1946, British investigators, working from SS records and testimonies of other captured officers, began closing the net. They believed Höss was living and hiding in Germany. They eventually traced him through his family. Under pressure and threats of arrest, his wife broke. She revealed where he was hiding, but only after being told her children would suffer if she didn't cooperate. On March 11, 1946, British soldiers found Höss in a barn at the edge of the property. At first, he claimed he was someone else, but after being identified by a scar and fingerprint records, he gave up. His arrest was quiet and without resistance. Once in custody, he began to talk. What came next stunned even hardened investigators. Höss wrote a detailed, clinical confession. In cold, matter-of-fact language, he described how Auschwitz had been planned, built, and operated. He outlined train schedules, gas chamber designs, cremation rates, and selection procedures. He even named fellow officers and described the use of Zyklon B without hesitation. He showed no emotion, no regret, no sorrow. His confession wasn't a cry for forgiveness. It was a technical report, as if he were still explaining a factory process. And now, the world would judge him face to face. In 1946, Höss was brought to testify at the Nuremberg trials, where major Nazi leaders were being prosecuted for crimes against humanity. His appearance was brief, but unforgettable. He calmly confirmed details of the mass extermination at Auschwitz. For many, his testimony was the first detailed account of how the Holocaust had been carried out on an industrial scale. After Nuremberg, Höss was extradited to Poland. In early 1947, he stood trial before the Supreme National Tribunal at Krakow. This time, the trial was more focused. The court had direct evidence. Survivors of Auschwitz testified, some describing in detail the selection ramp, the gas chambers, and the suffering they endured. Photographs taken by the SS and recovered after the war were shown in court. The brutality was undeniable, and so was Höss's role in it. On April 2, 1947, the court sentenced him to death. There was no appeal. The sentence was final. 2 weeks later, on April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was taken back to Auschwitz for his execution. A special gallows was built just meters from the ruins of Crematorium 1, one of the very buildings where thousands had died under his command. At 10 a.m., in the presence of officials and guards, Höss was hanged. His body was left hanging for some time as a symbolic act. It was the end of the man who ran Auschwitz. But no punishment, no matter how fitting, could reverse the horror he helped build. The smoke had long cleared, but the scars remained. But even in death, his shadow remained, because what he built at Auschwitz didn't just die with him. It became a permanent warning for generations.